the club and post over Zoom. George trained as a letterpress printer beginning in high school, continued his education at the Ontario College of Art, went on to get a Bachelor of Education at Brock and an MA in Communication and Culture after that. He's perhaps best known as an illustrator and as the creator of limited edition wordless narratives. And though his illustrated books and wordless narratives run the gamut from one on Trudeau, the first Trudeau, Conrad Black, Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, The Mysterious Death of Tom Thompson, and the victims of the 9/11 attack. So they cover a range of subjects. He's also written a book on how to do this called The Woodcut Artist's Handbook, Techniques and Tools for Relief Printmaking. And since 1985, he's been teaching those skills at OCAD. He's won numerous awards. Since 2002, he's been in the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts for achievements in Canadian book arts. He won Best Original Print at the Toronto Outdoor Art Exhibition in 1995, 1997, 2002, and 2005. In 2015, his Wordless Leonard Cohen Songbook. Got that? Wordless Leonard Cohen Songbook won first prize at the Alpine Society Book Design Awards for limited editions. So today he's going to tell us how he does that and illustrate it with his latest wordless story, Mary Pickford, Queen of the Silent Film Era. So a wordless narrative about a silent film. We can't wait. Thank you very much, George.
Thank you, Daphne. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I guess we can meet there. I think I'll just project my voice.
Do you want him to talk through the mic or is it okay?
I'm worried about feedback.
What about recording? Will the mic be crucial for that?
I think if it's just over here, I think you can pick up my voice if I just keep projecting my voice in this direction. Anyways, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm not wearing a mask because we're all social distance.
Linda, George is muted.
I'm trying to work on that. Daphne, we have no sound.
Are we supposed to be able to see George?
We're supposed to hear George. It's coming. I think there's just a glitch at their end. They
How about now?
That's much better. Thank you, George.
Do you hear me now? Well, great. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Technology always gets in the way of communication. It's not supposed to, but somehow through our best efforts and all of the technologies we've evolved, we can better frame those.
Only echoes.
We managed to communicate less with more. Anyways, I'm hoping to be able to communicate to you today the concepts that I'm interested in my work, how I make my artwork, and how I print my books, and where I get my ideas from. And I'm hoping to share some of those things with you today in this presentation. So bear with me. I have a number of slides that I'd like to hopefully I can advance my slides. Let's see. There we are. So, the first slide I wanted to show you, of course, is time axis. Many of you will recognize these little fellows trying to communicate to each other. And this is, of course, how I imagine we see things in our minds. You read a very descriptive passage in a book, and your brain makes pictures. And those pictures then communicate feelings and also memories. And so I'm interested in that notion. I'm also interested in this idea that the human brain processes visual information faster than text. This data I learned from a 3M system, but you know about this because of other studies that have been done, including the research that's been done into something known as the GUI, the graphic user interface. Images tend to give more information faster than a passage of text or even a single word. And so I'm interested in that notion. So what is visual narrative? You already know what visual narratives are because you're living in visual narratives. They're always, as you walk, if you can see, as you walk through the world, you're constantly seeing things and sorting through them and trying to figure out what is going on. So for me, it's a sequence or a single image used to communicate a story without the use of letter forms or words. It emerges, a picture emerges as a text and becomes the primary method of storytelling. And of course, in the art gallery, you've all stood in front of paintings from the 15th and 16th century, and their themes would have been very common to people of that time period, but often we can't read them anymore because we are no longer literate in, say, the pagan mythology and et cetera that were popular at that time. The cartoonist Art Spiegelman said, wordless novels are filled with language. It just resides in the user's head and rather than on the page. And in the background there, he has some slides of the work of Frans Maurer, who's a hero of mine, a Belgian artist who has influenced my work. But think about the use of pictures in terms of the reads. Here is from my own personal collection, a hieroglyphic Bible from 1795. In it, it is gospel passages written with pictures in place of words. So signs and symbols that are incorporated in here help an early reader to digest information that they want to communicate. And the rebus became a very popular form of storytelling, and certainly it's been used in our time to tell stories to children and to help them learn how to read. But in contemporary culture, think about the ways that we communicate without words. This is a series of texts communicating with images alone, and of course, these are some hungry teenagers trying to figure out what would be the best thing to eat and who likes it and who doesn't. And I don't even have to tell you what this is about because you're reading it. And so reading pictures is not foreign. And of course, it's ancient, in fact. We've always read everything from footsteps in the sand and tracking animals, but more importantly, stars. It's how we got around. It's how we found our way in the world. We then created mythologies around what we saw in the skies. We saw pictures. In fact, we used the connect the dots concept in order to formulate mythologies so that we remember those positions in the sky. And so we're reading images everywhere we go. So my influences and inspiration, as I said earlier, one of the people who I admired was the wood engraver and artist Frans Maurer, whose work, these are just a few of his wordless narratives that I've collected over the years. He was a very good friend of Thomas Mann, the German intellectual, and Hesse. And both Hesse and Mann wrote introductions to his wordless narratives, which I believe Thomas Mann said were like cinematographic presentations, and that they were better than the films that we would see in the flickers. Masrell also said that the job of the artist is that he's a witness into the age in which he lives, and I firmly believe that we can't escape our own time, and so therefore one of the jobs of the artist is to reflect what that is to
George,
the future or
I'm
present.
sorry, you're echoing at home.
Who did these books back in the 1920s, early part of the 20th century, wordless narratives created with wood engravings that he carved out of the end grain of woods like boxwood. And of course, I was mentioning that the introductions to these books were written by many important scholars of the time, such as Thomas Mann and Hermann Hesse, or authors, I should say. Anyways, and of course, this quote, which I believe is important in understanding what artists do or their role in society. Another artist who studied in Europe in the 1920s and 27, he and his wife May McTeer, this of course is Lynn Ward. He saw the work of Franz Maserel, was influenced to take it back to the United States. And in the 1930s, he produced Wild Pilgrimage and a number of other wordless narratives that became very popular. A lot of these works were social critiques, and they were interested in the temperature of the times. And like Maserel saying that the artist's role is to communicate their time. He also said this, he said, Lytton Ward I'm speaking of, if understanding is dependent upon words, the narrative is probably more properly described as a work of illustration. So here I'm arguing with my work is that it's not illustration because there is a different element to it. He says here, no matter how impressive in draftsmanship or how much of the available space is occupied, it is secondary. The image is a form of text. And in communication theory, I think there's a number of theorists that understand that notion of the image as text, and we know that from advertising and other devices in our culture that influence the way we think. Lawrence Hyde is the first Canadian who picks this up. He was also a friend of Lynn Ward. His introduction to his book about the testing of an atomic weapon in the Bikini Atolls, he did this in the 1950s. His book is called Southern Cross. He later used this book to get a job at the National Film Board and later became a well-known documentary filmmaker. Although his credentials were that he could engrave wordless narratives. And this was a critique of the American testing in the Bikini Atolls. And it was censored in the United States because, of course, in the 1950s, there was a paranoia of communism in the United States that frustrated selling such works there. And these are just some samples of the engravings that Hyde did. Hyde said, novels or stories in picture form are close to theater mime in the technique. There's something of the story ballet. He says, I think in Southern Cross, as well as in something of the film, the result must be easy to follow. So that he tried to create his narrative so you could follow the story, but he's not really saying anything in words about the atomic testing. He's showing us what he feels is the consequences of such actions on the planet, on the environment. And I'll remind you that this was in the early 50s, so in 51. The Bikini Atolls, they towed the Japanese fleet into the Bikini Atolls and then decided to set off this weapon while they tested anti-radiation cream on goats. There's film footage on YouTube if you are curious. This is a book I did of those artists that have influenced my work. It's called Graphic Witness. It's not my work. It's the work of these artists going up into the 1950s. I recently revised and expanded it. This year it came out by last year, I mean, Firefly Books. And I added the work of Eric Glass, who had a nightmare in 1942 on a kibbutz. After he'd left Germany in 1938, he started having nightmares and did a series of woodcuts depicting the horrors that he believed was happening in Germany. And the members of the kibbutz told him he wasn't allowed to post these images because they was spreading fear. And at that time, they didn't know about the Holocaust. And I thought that was an important narrative to include in this, this collection of wordless narratives. So The woodcut is one of the oldest graphic mediums, and all of the images I've showed you, including the artists who've influenced me, are working in the woodcut form, also known as xylography, and also known as wood engraving. These are all that I use different tools. I'm going to explain the difference of these things. So what is the difference between, say, woodcut and wood engraving? Xylography is woodcut. It's just what the Europeans use instead of the term that we use, which is woodcut. Wood engraving is done on the end grain of the wood. So most woodcuts are done on the plank. This is done where you see the rings, and because you can't get very large blocks, the blocks have to be glued together. And I use different tools than a woodcut artist does. A woodcut artist uses parting tools and gouges. I use spit stickers and elliptical tint tools and lining tools and scorpers. And of course, the traditional engraver, which I have pictured there. And of course, the goal of the wood engraver is to create illusion on the block, and they do this by creating white lines. To create a black line, however, one has to engrave 2 white lines. So wood engraving is often called the art of the white line because, of course, you're starting with a black solid base and you're working backwards. That's the block that created that image that you just saw. And woodcut. Woodcut, of course, is using parting tools and gouges. Lino cut is related to this. And lino cut is really just a battleship linoleum is what we use. It's a burlap backed wood byproduct that is suitable for carving on, and has been used traditionally ever since the First World War. And of course, the inventor of wood engraving is given to Thomas Buick, who may not have been the first person to engrave on the end grain of a piece of wood. And I just donated a wood engraving block that was done in 1581 to the Fisher Rare Book Library. It's the Potosi block that I discovered, and it was done on the end grain, but it has a flaw. It's cracked to the middle because end grain wood tends to crack to the core. But what was the contribution of Buick was that he realized that he was trained as a silversmith. He realized that he could use those same tools on the end grain of wood to get more detail. And many of you are familiar with this illustration beside him, which he didn't do, which is of course done by John Tenniel and engraved by the DeZale brothers engraving firm that was very active in London at the time as book engravers. And it is signed at the bottom by Tenniel with his monogram, as well as the DeZale brothers. Wood engraving led to catalog work. We wouldn't have catalogs if it wasn't for the invention of wood engraving. It allowed for very detailed images to be created on the end grain of wood, which could be printed at the same time as type, because the technology that was primarily used throughout the early part of the 19th and 20th centuries was, of course, the letterpress printing. And that meant typeset was set on linotype machines or handset, and then engravings were created on wood, and then stereotypes, there's a good word, stereotypes, if you ever wondered where that word came from, it was borrowed by psychology. Stereotypes were created of the blocks. The blocks were not printed. And that's often a myth that people think that the blocks that were engraved would be printed. That would be foolish, because on the press, a lump of paper and a piece of the pulp that you have, paper could cause a dent in the block and damage it forever. But if you use a stereotype, which is a casting method, you could get a fresh image off the block in a very short period of time using a technology that was developed in the 18th century. It involved a flong and other things. Anyways, here's another commercial engraving. So you can see the black, the reason the black is around there is because these were cast. They weren't printed directly from the wood engraving block. That image there, I printed directly from this block. And it's an early example of the kind of catalog work, very detailed, almost photographic. And speaking of photographic, by 1899, the transfer of photographs to the end grain of engrained wood of boxwood was very, very common. And the halftone patterns were created by tools known as lining tools. And this was a very common way to get images quickly onto the end grain of wood, would be to transfer a photograph onto the wood, and then the engraver would interpret the gray tones with lining tools. And that apprenticeship was 7 years. So they got very good at being able to identify what marks these engraving tools would have to make in order to create those illusions on the end grain of the wood. I've written about this in my book, The Woodcutter's Handbook, about the history of woodcut and wood engraving and its impact on culture and society, and how important it was for creating communication technologies that evolved things that led to things like catalogs, which of course led to Amazon. Because without catalogs and shopping and seeing what you're buying, it really changed the way we understood commodities. I want to talk a bit about my process now, what I do in order to create an image. So, and for a book. And one of the things that inspired me was the mysterious death of Tom Thomson. I took my boys up to Algonquin Park every year, and of course that myth of how he died goes around up there. A lot of it is not true, and some of it is slightly true. And of course, it's all about the story, because it was an unsolved crime. If it was a crime, I mean, many people think that he just fell out of the boat, a canoe, and others believe that that wasn't so, that perhaps he was killed. Anyways, here I am sketching in Algonquin Park, and this is where I gathered a lot of my images, but not the only place. I also did research in libraries and looked at some of the photographs that we have that Thomson took and his colleagues, because Thomson was interested in photography. Although he never wrote anything himself, he certainly did a lot of sketching. I also looked at Toronto at the time and looked at how we were building our infrastructure. And I was inspired by the photographs like this one, and photographs like this one, and like this one. Now, for some reason, there's one of my engravings inspired by that streetcar. Of course, it's in reverse because everything I do is in reverse. Because when you transfer it onto the block, when it prints, it reverses. So I live in a mirror world. And here, of course, is Bay Street. Thomson worked just down the street from there at the Grip, which was a graphic design firm. And Tom Thomson was an expert at the Ben-Day process, which is a process of putting tones in the backs of photographs. We think of Thomson as only a painter, and we're not interested in his commercial work. And for many of us, we wouldn't recognize it if we saw it. I was interested in transportation at the time too. Of course, there was a lot of mud. Yonge Street had a lot of mud on it. And I imagined that Thomson would be walking through this and pass all this stuff on a daily basis. And there's my picture of Thomson walking beside the disabled car. And I found pictures such as this one. A lot of them, they're not in archives. It's a great place to look for early photographs of Toronto. And here you can see I've also included Thomson in this engraving. And there's the block. So it's I carved all these images on end grain maple for obvious reasons, because I'm a Canadian and it's a Canadian topic. And so this is a proof of that. So you can see how the image is reversed and impressions are taken from the block. And these are my good friends, Tom Smart and the famous author Ross King. Many of you may have read books by Ross King. He's written everything from Brunelleschi's Domo to Defiant Spirits, which is the history of the Group of Seven. And Tom and Ross, you might know Tom Smart because he's the curator and the CEO of the Beaverbrook Museum. They are avid canoers and were out and thought they found the place where Thomson had sketched Bing Inlet, and they brought me back a piece of wood from that space and based on this painting, and they said, we really believe that this piece of wood is one of the trees in this picture. And I said, oh, that's great. I'm going to include it in my book. And so these two engravings here, the reason they're that funky shape is because I had trouble getting the blocks type high and getting them square, but I managed to get it. I wanted to get engravings on these blocks because I like that connection between the space, the time, and what I was doing. So that's my work is not advancing. Oh, there we go. And there's my engraving of Bing Inlet. And there's the blocks you can see that I use. One of them cracked. That's what I cracked on the press. So visual transitions, how I move between image to image. And I've shown you these two images earlier, and I told you that I put Thompson in all of these. And here's one where he's at the train. And one of the things about Thompson was he was not allowed to join the military. And of course, at the time, the First World War in 1914, there was a lot of pressure from society to join the military, and Thompson was feeling that pressure. And maybe one of the reasons why he escaped Toronto whenever he could by taking the train up to Algonquin Park, which one could do at that time. And if you look closely here, this woman under the green circle, she has a feather, a white feather in her head. And at the time, it was very common for young men to be feathered with a white feather if they were not in uniform or looked like they were healthy, but were not part of the war effort. And there was a lot of taunting. And I can imagine that Thompson was fed up with that. He had tried to join two places, and some say that it was his friend, Dr. McCallum, who prevented him from getting into the military, which he did want to join. So these are some other images. Oh, sorry. So about picture narratives here, I've created some images based on historical photographs. Others are completely invented, like Dr. McCallum here and Tom Thompson admiring one of his paintings in his cabin. And other pictures are based upon the historical record. I am also interested in movement, and this, in my theory of Thompson's death, was that he was murdered, and I agree that with some other authors too, and McGregor being one of them, that he may have been killed by Shannon Fraser. So I pose that in the narrative, but I don't say anything, so you can't accuse me of saying something. And so don't forget, it's a wordless narrative. Also, I'm taking some of Thompson's iconic paintings, and I'm keeping the basic form of them, but changing them. So they are recognizable as the pine and west wind. So you can see here that Jack Pine up at the top is his painting, but you can see mine has been compressed and I've changed it somewhat. But if you just see it without the context of the painting, you go, oh, that looks a lot like Tom Thompson. So it's an intentional reference. So I'm referencing things just the same way as you would with text. If you were writing a scholarly paper, you're making a reference or you're paraphrasing someone. And here we can actually see one of Thompson's commercial works, a design for an advertisement that he did. And then you can also see here his other West Wind painting, which I've also reimagined. And I also do a lot of sketches. So I wanted the argument that was the famous argument that Robinson, who was the ranger up at the Canoe Lake at the time, said there was these arguments that were going on. They were fighting over things like the war effort, and whether who was in the wrong, and things like that. And there was a Belcher, a man who was living up at Canoe Lake at the time, was rumored not only to be a German, but to be he fled the United States because he was a Pinkerton's man and had gotten into some trouble. And so he and Thompson were not friends. So these were the engravings that I did from that. And Winnie Trainor, there's rumors that he may have had a relationship because he was often seen with Winnie when they go hiking together, and her parents had a cabin up in Canoe Lake. And so I imagine that they did have a relationship. After his death, after he mysteriously went missing, Winnie disappeared too for about a year and then came back. So the rumor is, although there's no proof of this, is that she may have been pregnant. So of course we bring in some romance. What is a story? Any good story without a bit of romance in it? And so I did use some photos that we have of Thompson, and then reinterpreted them as engravings. So of course, the grays in this analog photo reimagined into the more black and white of the wood engraving that I'm interested in. And here I am on my press, and you can see I've just pulled the title page off that, which I've carved out of wood. And this is the project itself. So I did over 109 wood engravings for this project, more if you consider the ones that I rejected. And then I printed a limited edition of this book. And then another project was the Wordless Leonard Cohen Songbook. I thought, what gives Leonard Cohen his greatest power? His words. He was a great writer and poet. And I was really upset when he didn't get the Nobel Prize, and they gave it to that other folk singer. But I thought that the interesting thing about power and in culture is that how can you express it visually? Can you just make pictures of someone and that can tell a story about that person, who they're standing beside and their relationship. And here you can see it locked up in the press, the wood engraving block, and I've used lead type for this particular copy, for the Wordless Leonard Cohen. I've made wood engravings of his songs, of people he associated with, his girlfriends, his fellow musicians, his friends and family members. So I make, in some cases, I make my own blocks. So I order wood and then I have to cut it to type high, which is 0.918, 918 thousandths of an inch thick. So there's an accuracy that has to happen here in order to make these blocks, because to run on my press effectively, they have to be the same height as a piece of type, is also known as type high. And once I've got my blocks and I've sanded them, then I either transfer or draw directly onto the block, and then I start my engraving. And here you can see all my tools in front of me, my studio, and then I'll draw onto the block, and I'll draw even after I've carved. I'll do proofs and then go back in, carving, and then proofing. And this is the process that I go through for all my engravings. Here I'm running some proofs on my press. And there's my studio. It's very small, but and messy because I've always got projects on the go. And there I am on my press, checking some proofs. And I also bind my own books. So this is one of the things I teach too, is different book binding techniques. And so they're all hand sewn using linen thread and the best of materials. I also like to throw myself in all my narratives, just like Alfred Hitchcock used to make appearances. So in my books, you'll find me playing characters. And so I do that. And so in the Book of Hours, I was making coffee in one of the Twin Towers. The Book of Hours is a story of 9/11 from the day before right up until the planes hit. And I was interested in the role of people who we don't think about in terms of fighting a larger battle, because the struggle for power is always fought by those that have none. And I was interested in that notion of all these workers who would be in the office slugging away, and they were killed on a battleground that they didn't even know existed. So that's the Book of Hours. I printed 2 editions of 10, one on Saint Armand paper and another on Japanese washi paper, a type of gampi. I also did a book on Conrad Black, and my publisher, because I get popular editions made of my limited edition books, he said, "You publish anything by Conrad Black and I won't publish it." And I said, "That's okay," but he says, "You'll get sued. He's very litigious. You're going to be sued, Walker. It's just crazy. Don't do that." And I said, "But what if I get him to approve it?" He says, "It's not going to happen." So he was easy to find because he was in prison. And so I wrote to him in Miami, and I told him what I wanted to do, that I wanted to do a wordless narrative about his life. I didn't want to say anything. I mean, here is a man whose power is based upon words. And I'm suggesting to him, I'd like to write a book about you and not say anything. He agreed. He signed all the books. I did 13 books. And I sold them all almost instantly, mostly to lawyers. who are just curious. And the Globe Mail did a full page. They're going, "You did a wordless what on who?" So I got lots of attention for that. I was interested, being the type of person who thinks that democracy works when we don't all say that we're only on one side, that we listen to everyone carefully and then vote. I was interested in the left, the right, the center. I think that's important. And so I didn't want to write Conrad Black off. I would read his articles in the National Post. I'd even write him my own comments of what I thought, what he was saying. And of course, if you're going to do that, you have to go and do the liberals too. So I immediately embarked upon the life and times of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And I managed to convince his son, who wasn't prime minister at the time, to write the introduction to this. So Justin agreed to write the introduction. He signed them all. And so I created a limited edition book about the life and times of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And I took away everything that gave him power, which was his words. Of course, a very eloquent speaker. And I made 80 blocks because, of course, Trudeau lived to be 80. And I printed them in a limited edition of 15 signed and numbered copies because he was the 15th Prime Minister of Canada. And so here you can see, here's his Miss Sinclair, who becomes his wife, of course, also known as Maggie Trudeau, and at Tahiti, where they first met. There's no photograph of this. I invented it. But I like doing stuff like that. And somebody said, but some of your images look like photographs. Intentional, because we have a faith in photography. We think that photography is a form of truth. Don't be so gullible. Photography, it can be just as much a liar as anything else, but so can there be truth in a painting, truth in pictures in general. And so I'm interested in those things. So here in my neighborhood, there is the Alexander Murr schoolhouse, which is just a few streets over from me in Leslieville. And there's this tree that came down is the Maple Leaf Forever tree that he wrote that famous anthem. And I thought, wow, I have to get a piece of that tree. So I went there and they were stopping me. Of course, they were concerned with my safety. I went, no, I need a piece of this tree for this piece I'm doing. Of course, they're just seeing a mad artist. And I ended up having to go to City Hall. And they said, well, we can't just give it to you for free. And I said, okay, how much do you want? They said, well, you'll have to make a donation. And I said, well, how about $5? They said, fine, give us $5, you can take what you need. I said, okay. So this block here of Pierre Elliott Trudeau is engraved on a piece of maple from the Maple Leaf Forever tree. And I like the idea that there's a story, of course, behind the tree and the making of the block and the narrative that it holds. The work I just finished the last couple of years is Mary Pickford, the Queen of the silent film era, in 87 wood engravings. And each copy of the book, I also have a drawer in it where I've included for film. Some of it is that very, very fragile film that Pickford shot on. I have had a few feet of the nitrate film, and I include some of that and other memorabilia from her time. And I thought that brings the reader closer to that time period. Now, this is not technically a wordless narrative. It is it's a silent film in book format because I've created intertitles to tell the story of Mary Pickford. And these below, you can see, are some of the engravings that I created for that. And I just have this short, and I don't think we can have the sound on this. Can we turn?
Try it. You have to turn it on.
I have to turn it on or off? Hello, what?
No, on. I turned it off because of the.
If it's just a story
Okay, here I'm
being
gonna.
deadpanned to you,
I'm gonna.
you
start
tend
this over.
to not be.
Okay, here we are.
A story is always better if it's animated by the storyteller. If it's just a story being deadpanned to you, you tend to not be engaged in it. So yeah, I would say that that's an important part of engaging with narrative, is to bring life to it. I think it brings life to your images and your art. Self-doubt, I guess, would be one of my weaknesses. Is I'm never Sure. Did I make the right choice? But I would say that all of us are that way too, a little bit, that we all have a bit of self-doubt. Perhaps that's healthy too, that you're never sure that you made the right decision. So when I'm trying to work out what a person's life was, part of that has been narrated, maybe by them, maybe by someone else. The other part was what they experienced. So my goalposts are to find out where the narrative and the experiential meet in a visual image.
Oh, I wonder if I'll put this back here. So self-doubt, what I mean by that, before you ask that question, is that when I'm making a cut on that, when I make a cut on that block, I'm not sure that that's going to look good. And if I cut the block and it turns out to be crap, I have to start over because there's no going back. There's no returning the block to its original condition. It's a complete subtractive process. So I have to be very much engaged in that. This is a book published by Firefly Books called Written in Wood, which is a collection of 3 of my wordless graphic narratives. I've done a number of graphic narratives which the Porcupine Quill has published in popular editions, and these are them there. I've also encouraged my students and friends to also do wordless narratives, and these are some of the wordless narratives that my friends and colleagues and students have done and been published by the Porcupine's Quill, exploring that idea of the picture story. That's my presentation. I'm so happy that most of you stayed awake and that you were able to hear some or most of what I had to say. So I'm eager to answer your questions.